Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the meta that's been developing on day 9, looking at what's been popular so far, but this time, we're going to be looking at the solo self-found game mode. So solo self-found is a hard mode. It is strictly harder than the base game because you've got the same options as in the base game, but you are explicitly banned from trading with other players, and you're explicitly banned from grouping with other players. The grouping thing is significant in Path of Exile 2 because there are a number of pretty important milestone achievements in your character's progression, particularly quadruple ascending and even triple ascending, that are much harder if you have to do them yourself. In Trade League, you can definitely group with another player. They can carry you through some of these difficult encounters. In SSF, that's not an option, and so you have to beat them entirely by yourself. Additionally, if you're going through the Trials of the Sekhmet to ascend, aka Sanctum, that's what it's called in POE 1, you're not able to trade for honor resistance relics the way that you could in Trade League, and that is a huge factor in making that content harder than it would otherwise be. So if you're a Trade League player though, you might find that there's some inspiration you can take here as to which ascendancies are working out well, and then you can always look to optimize them even further using things that may not be an option if you were to be playing in solo self-found. Now, I do want to make one little comment about game balance in general, and that is that Energy Shield is outperforming Life by so much at the moment that I kind of expect grinding your games will actually intervene on this and adjust it. Whether that takes the form of a buff to Life, a nerf to Energy Shield, or probably more likely a bit of both at the same time, expect that that's going to cause ripples to spread throughout the meta, which might take a little while to actually fully develop. It is early access after all. We've already seen massive buffs to a number of underutilized mechanics, block in particular, leech as well. They've both been massively buffed. And then at the same time, we've seen massive nerfs to other things such as the trigger gems. Everything's going to be up in the air. That's going to continue, especially in the early days of early access when they try to work out the most egregious over and underperformers. So our methodology here, Grinding Your Games published the ladder. In Path of Exile 1, this is a really definitive list of the top 15,000 players by XP, and also links to their characters. Now they can opt out of this, but most people don't, and it gives you a sense of what they're wearing, it gives you a sense of what build decisions they've made, tells you the skills they're using, all sorts of information like that. In PoE 2, none of that's happening. All you get is the top 1,000 players by XP and the ascendancy that they've chosen. But there's still some real information to be gleaned from that, and that's what we're going to be doing in this video. Now in this video, I'm going to give special weighting to people who are level 92 plus. I chose that threshold because I was looking for the top 50 by XP, and then I realized, no, we'll just go with the nearest level to that. So that was either going to be 92 plus or 91 plus, and 92 plus ended up being closer to the top 50. I think it's important to state there has been time for people to reroll. Now this is not necessarily the case for people who play the game pretty casually. You probably haven't had time to explore one character, decide you don't like it, and then roll another one yet. However, for people who play the game enough that they could plausibly be on the ladder, they absolutely have had time to do this, especially because rerolls in Path of Exile 2 are a lot faster than first characters. You have all the hand-me-down gear, you also know all of the boss fights to some extent. You might not have them all committed to memory yet, but you have a vague sense of what to do, what not to do. In particular, if there's ones that were really troublesome for you, then you'll know how you beat them the last time. So for that reason, I'm not going to normalize for pre-launch hype as much as I did in the previous video, which was a day 3 look at Trade League, because on day 3, you had not had the opportunity to reroll and then get back to a high level on your new character. But probably the biggest limitation we've got here is that, like I said earlier, we can't see people's builds. We can't tell the difference between someone who's playing a Chaos Inoculation monk versus a Life monk versus a Life and Energy Shield hybrid monk. We can't tell which of these they're picking unless the class choice really strongly pushes in a certain direction. Likewise, we can't tell whether people are investing in evasion, whether they're investing in armor, whether they're investing in entirely different mitigation strategies for damage. Or we can't tell anything much about the skills they're using, except for things that are known to be massive overperformers. For instance, using some tools that are not really plausible to have together in solo self-found that are more trade only at the moment, there are definitely some really overpowering strategies that involve Vine Arrow. Things that probably don't exist much in SSF yet, but that those are then making certain ascendancies, the Deadeye and the Pathfinder, do better than they might without them. I want a quick comment on what a low-performing ascendancy means. Sometimes ascendancies do badly because they're just bad. I feel that's the case for the Acolyte of Chayula. But sometimes there is tech that's needed to make the ascendancy shine, and it's not yet being worked out, or it's not being shared to too many people as yet. And a single interaction can rocket a build from F tier up to S tier once it becomes popularized, once a lot of people know about it. That said, it is important to note that if an ascendancy is performing low, it means that the obvious ways to build that ascendancy are not working very well at the moment. I mentioned pre-launch hype is not going to be taken as seriously in this video as it was in the Day 3 Trade League equivalent, but I thought I'd just quickly mention here my feelings of pre-launch hype for each ascendancy. S tier for the Invoker, A tier for the Blood Mage, Infernalist, Stormweaver, B tier for the Titan, Gemling Legionnaire, Witchhunter and Chronomancer, C tier for Deadeye and Warbringer, F tier for Acolyte of Chayula and Pathfinder. It's kind of hard to judge this exactly, and there's probably a couple of things that are a bit wrong around the edges there, but I feel that's a reasonable estimate as to where the hype was this time 10 or 12 days ago. Alright, so we're going to start by discussing the Titan. Pre-launch, I had this in B tier for hype, and its performance has outperformed that. It's an A tier performer. Now, getting 142 of the top 1,000 would be enough to possibly almost put you in S tier, but there's only 4 level 92 plus Titans, and so because there's this bias towards people being at the lower end of the top 1,000 than at the higher end, for that reason, I'm unwilling to put the Titan all the way up in S tier. That said, it is still getting more than 1/12 of the ladder by a long shot, and more than 1/12 of those level 92 plus characters as well. It's modestly exceeding pre-launch hype, and the pre-launch hype was a little bit real on this. Now, many players report the 50% increased effect of small nodes 4-pointer in the Titan Ascendancy is performing extremely well. And this is far better than that would in Path of Exile 1, where masteries and notables are more of your character's power budget. In Path of Exile 2, there are no masteries, and that means you just take more small nodes than you would in Path of Exile 1. Warbringer comes next, and pre-launch the hype for this was around C tier, and it has met but not exceeded that hype. 55 people in the top 1,000 are playing this Ascendancy. This would get you into B tier. The problem is, though, that once you get to level 90 plus, the Ascendancy falls off really hard. There is only one level 92, and if we look a bit below that, there is only one level 90. So the performance is falling off really badly about level 89 for this Ascendancy. That's why I'm downgrading it to C tier, whereas it might have otherwise been B tier, based on having 55 of the top 1,000. So essentially, this Ascendancy is meeting but not exceeding its modest pre-launch expectations, and I'm going to put it in C tier overall. The Deadeye comes next. Pre-launch, not hyped all that much because it's a class power fantasy that exists and has often dominated in Path of Exile 1. Ladder performance not as dominant as it was in Trade League, especially early on. That said, it still very solidly gets into A tier, 172 of the top 1,000, so more than a sixth, and 6 of the level 92 plus characters, so a little bit less than a sixth there. So this is lower performance than it was in early Trade League, but it's still extremely high performance. I suspect one of the factors here is that some of the Vine Arrow shenanigans that are possible in Trade League aren't really considered to be all that realistic in SSF at the moment, and as a result, there's something that the Deadeye can do if you're playing in Trade that it can't do here. That said, it's still a really good Ascendancy for all of its other skills. Pathfinder comes next, and this is a C tier, maybe even a D tier ladder performance, but it was one of the least hyped Ascendancies going into Path of Exile 2. So it's taking up 23 of the top 1,000 spots and 1 of the top 41, which is an adequate performance, but not particularly great. Given the low level of hype though, and the fact that people aren't really feeling drawn into re-rolling into it, I think that it's doing okay. Overall, I'm actually going to put this in B tier, higher than the ladder performance would indicate, and that is just a reflection of the fact that there was so little pre-launch hype for this, and I think it is probably actually outperforming average as a result. But at the same time, it really overperformed expectations in Trade on days 1, 2, and 3, and we haven't seen an influx of people jumping over to Pathfinder that I can see. Chronomancer comes up next. Pre-launch, this was really hyped, put it in B tier. Ladder performance, unfortunately, very much an F tier. 11 of the top 1,000, no one's exceeded level 90 yet, and so I'm putting this in F tier overall. This is significantly underperforming the pretty high expectations that were around for it, and unlike Trade, I don't think there's going to be a lot of people re-rolling into this Ascendancy. In Trade League, there is the unique chess piece Temporalis. Now, this is extraordinarily hard to get your hands on. This requires the flawless no-hit Sanctum run, and as a result, I don't expect many of these will exist on the server at all during early access. However, there will be people who aspire to owning one, and because it is so strongly thematically tied to the Chronomancer, I expect most of them will roll a Chronomancer for it, either before or after they secure this expensive item. But in Solo Self-Found, the number of Temporalises that's likely to exist is not going to be very large, and this factor won't be a pull into the Chronomancer Ascendancy as a result. All in all, Chronomancer, one of the lowest performers all around. Stormweaver is next. Pre-launch hype on this was A tier. Now, I'm actually going to put this in S tier on its ladder performance. Not so much based on the number of the top 1,000 it got, that would only be solidly an A tier with 118, but we have 12 of the top 41 characters and 2 of the top 3 are playing Stormweavers. That really calls out to you that this Ascendancy is in a powerful place. Overall, I'm going to put this in S tier, despite the fact that it started with a fair bit of hype, but I also want to put in a caveat that Stormweaver is one of those things that could be affected if grinding your games decide to adjust the life energy shield balance a little bit. Then you might see Stormweaver's popularity fall off as a result. So we'll have to watch on that. Witchhunter comes next. Pre-launch, I had this hyped at B tier. Ladder performance, I think, is C tier. 72 of the top 1,000 would be quite good. B tier, definitely. But absolutely none of the top 41. Now, there is one person that's fairly close, but they didn't quite make the cut. And then the class just seems to fall off really hard around level 89. This seems to be something that's going on with a few of the Ascendancies. They perform really well up to about level 90 or a little bit below, and then they fall off really badly. Overall, I'm going to put the Witchhunter in C tier as a result. Gemling Legionnaire comes up next. This was a B tier pre-launch hype, but its latter performance is also solidly in the C tier. 37 of the top 1,000 is underperforming expectations. 1 of the top 41 is underperforming expectations, but is not underperforming by a massive amount either. So I'm going to put this in C tier overall. You could argue that it's C- or D tier. It's doing considerably worse than average, but not crushingly worse than average. Next up we have Invoker, and I thought long and hard about whether I was going to call this an S tier performance or an A tier performance or an A+ tier performance. Ultimately, I decided to settle on A, but I certainly wouldn't fault you if you decided otherwise. Pre-launch, I feel the hype for this Ascendancy was S tier. Its ladder performance, I'm putting in an A tier, but you can certainly argue it's A+. 158 of the top 1,000, 8 of them have hit 92+, so it's something that is both pushing people up to the top of the ladder, but also up to the very top. I decided Stormweaver ultimately was in a tier of its own, but if you disagree, that's perfectly reasonable. Overall, I'm putting the Invoker in A tier. It's performing adequately, slightly below expectations, but those expectations were sky high, and so there's nothing wrong with that. With the Invoker, we all respect it, whether we put it in A tier, A+ tier, or S tier. With the Acolyte of Chayula, I would like to invite you to press F to pay disrespects. This Ascendancy is in a terrible place. It was actually quite hyped originally, and then Grinding Your Games released the full stats of the Ascendancy, and that hype went stone cold. Well, the performance has lived up to these low expectations. 12 people have played this Ascendancy into the top 1,000, no one has played it into the top 41, and no one's even really close. The highest level is level 90. Overall, Acolyte of Chayula is living in F tier at the moment, and it's going to stay there until it gets some sort of mechanical changes, some sort of buffs to the Ascendancy that make it compelling to at least consider playing. Okay, so let's talk about the Blood Mage. This was hyped a lot going into the game. I put it in A tier for pre-launch hype. Now, the ladder performance on this has been D tier. 26 of the top 1,000 players, but none of them are level 92+. There's someone that's not too far behind. We're not looking at something that is putting up electric performances on the ladder or anything remotely close to the amount of pre-launch hype that existed. Overall, I'm putting this in D tier, but I think it's worth saying that the Blood Mage was very heavily affected by Week 1 patches. Now, this was interesting in that those patches were primarily buffs to this Ascendancy, but they did break one of the ways people were playing it. So in Week 1, Trigger Gems were overpowered in Path of Exile 2, but then at the same time, the Blood Mage Ascendancy was woefully underpowered. What happened was that the Blood Mage Ascendancy generally got substantial buffs. Now, this is only through changes to Life Leech, but those Life Leech buffs feel really substantial. And so as a result, the Blood Mage fixed its major problem that it had as an Ascendancy, the thing that was making it borderline on unplayable. But then at the same time, the main way people had gotten around the fact that the Ascendancy was so bad was to abuse some of the Trigger Gems with it. And all the builds that were doing that ended up in a really bad spot after those changes. So you had this weird patch that killed off the best Blood Mage builds at the same time as providing space for new ones to shine. And so where does this leave us? It leaves us in a spot where the Blood Mage's future is a bit uncertain. I don't think the buffs quite went far enough. I think they've got it into a playable state, but not into a good state. And as a result, I'm not really sold that we're going to see a lot of people jumping into the Blood Mage yet, but it's one buff away from becoming a lot better. And there's also the potential for someone to just discover something that's not particularly obvious and turn this into a much better setup than it is at the moment. It's currently D tier. It was F tier in the trade video earlier. It feels like it's getting into a better place, but it is not yet in a good place. Watch this space though, and expect future change. And then we're going to finish with the Infernalist, which I am putting an A+ tier on its ladder performance. And again, you could easily make a case that this is an S tier performer. 174 of the top 1,000, 8 of them level 92 plus, and this is based on pre-launch hype of A tier. Overall, this is meeting high expectations that the player base had in it. It's A or A plus tier overall. And some of the early concerns about this ascendancy falling off pretty hard once it got to maps, these have been solved. It was definitely the case looking at the Trade League data from day 3 that people were struggling a bit to progress their Infernalists once they got into the low 80s in levels, but those issues have all been solved now, and people are starting to really progress a lot further on this ascendancy. And I wanted to leave you with a really simple final thought. Play what looks fun. It's early access. Who cares if you pick something that's not super optimal? But if in doubt, if you want the game to be a little bit easier the first time you go through it, pick something that's in A tier or higher, and also pick something that has good synergies with Energy Shield, unless you want to hedge against the potential for future near-term nerfs. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results.